Hey guys, how is it going? I wanted to put up a video real quick to give a big picture of where we are in church history. I think we're like halfway through the semester, which is actually kind of crazy, and wanted to just pause for a minute and take a look at the big picture of church history. As before we kind of move too far forward, we are getting really close to the Reformation and looking at everything that has with it. So, on Populi, you should see a blank sheet with, I think it says something about the big picture or overview of church history on it. And I wanted to give this to you. This is really from a sort of a theological perspective on what's happening in church history. And so, what we're going to do is I'm going to just walk through those major steps of mostly sort of people who have been in church history and the movements that have happened from them. So, on this one has all of it filled in here. And we have the early church and a lot to that. I think we've covered that pretty well. We have the medieval church, and really two of the biggest names in the medieval church would be Anselm. And the biggest thing to understand about Anselm, the reason why he is really important, is because he comes up with this phrase of faith seeking understanding. And so he is concerned about knowing what he believes, and then he's going to try to understand what it is that he believes. And so it's faith, you have faith, and then you seek understanding. And so essentially he starts with belief, and then he is going to say, all right, so I believe something. Now I'm going to try to understand what it is that I believe. And we're going to see how this is going to be important when we get to the Enlightenment. Then we have Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas is important because he takes the Bible and he sort of adds Aristotle on top of that. And so we get what is going to be called scholasticism. And scholasticism is sometimes it's really looked down on by a lot of Protestant people, but it really is this understanding, or it's trying to take faith and then make faith reasonable in the sense that we are able to think about our faith and we're able to bring logic and understanding into it. So it's not a bad movement. Calvin and Luther had some pretty negative things to say about it, but it is important. Okay. Then we have the Reformation, and probably the most important thing about the Reformation would be sola scriptura. So sola scriptura is the belief that the Bible is the only infallible word, or it's the only infallible rule of faith for the church. And especially Luther is going to take sola scriptura and investigate everything the church teaches in light of it. And we're going to see that played out quite a bit. Now, what we also have is, after the Reformation, this brings into the sort of this whole idea of the Enlightenment. And part of this goes back to what Anselm is saying about belief leading to understanding. You start with faith and then you have understanding. And part of the problem, or it's not really a problem, it's just a historical thing that happens, is because the Reformation is going to add, in addition to the Catholic faith, now we have the Protestant faith, right? So now there are two different types of believing. So what do you do when you're not sure which belief to pick, right? Then that kind of leads us with a problem. And what is going to happen with the Enlightenment is we're going to see, especially through Descartes, is that understanding comes before believing. So understanding, you understand something, and then if you properly understand it, then you can go on to believe it. All right. Now, this is really going to be huge for history and especially for thought, because the question is, okay, so what is understanding, right? And then what you're going to have is two different ways of understanding. And if we were a philosophy class, we would spend a lot of time looking at this, but we're not a philosophy class, so we'll just spend a little bit of time looking at it. But what ends up happening is the Enlightenment brings in that understanding is the most important thing. So, okay, well, how do we understand things? And what you're going to see are two very different ways of thinking about understanding. So, the first is the rationalists, and the rationalists say that you cannot trust your senses. Okay, so you cannot trust your senses. And this goes back to like Descartes, where he's saying, I see a water bottle in front of me. With my eyes, I see that. But there are times when I'm dreaming and I think I see things that aren't really there. So what if I'm just dreaming that there is a water bottle? I can't really ever be sure whether I'm dreaming or not, or whether it's kind of the brain in the vat thing where, maybe there's an experiment where a scientist has my brain in a vat and he's making me think I see things. And so the rational says you cannot trust your senses, whereas you're probably seeing where this is going, that the empiricists are going to say you can only trust your senses. And so these are two very different ways of thinking about the world. Like the rationalists will say, I know 2 + 2 is 2, or 2 + 2 is 4, because the definition of what 2 is, the definition of what addition is, the definition of what equals is, it's just reasonable to believe that, right? Whereas the empiricist is going to say, I know 2 and 2 is 4 because I had 2 apples, and then my brother gave me 2 more apples, and I did a little experiment, and I counted them all up, and I realized, okay, there were 2. Now I'm going to put another 2 here. Okay, that's 4. So I know it because I've experimented with this, right? And so what you see in basically, and we're going to see in a second how this really affects theology in the church, is that there are two very different ways of knowing. One is rationalist, the other is empiricist, and they don't really meet until we have this guy named Immanuel Kant, who is going to find a way of bringing these two things together. And again, this isn't a philosophy class, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but it's important to understand in the big flow of history of the church and theology what Kant is doing. What Kant does is he says there are two different types of realities. One is noumenal, and the other is phenomenal. Now, noumenal are real things that you can't experience. Phenomenal are real things that you can experience, okay? One of the ways to think about this, and again, there's a massive oversimplification, but you think of like waves, like there are light waves and there are sound waves. And when you look at when we look at a light wave hits your eye in a certain way that you're able to see it. A sound wave hits your ear in a certain way that you're able to hear it. But there are also different types of waves, like a radio wave, right? And so a radio wave is real, but you're not able to experience it because your body is not set up in such a way that you can experience like a radio wave, right? So here's theology. Here's why this is important, okay? Is that when you look at... And so what Kant is going to do, again, we're looking at Kant, he's going to say that God is noumenal, but not phenomenal. So what that means is that he's not saying there isn't a God. He's just saying that if there is a God, well, he's real, but you can't experience it, right? Like we can't experience God. What does God look like? Well, no one has seen God. What does God sound like? Well, no one's heard God. What does God smell like? What's he taste like? Well, we can't experience him, so we can't really talk about him. Okay, so what Kant does is that he is going to say, all right, so from an Enlightenment viewpoint, reality is either things that you can experience or can't experience. Since you can't experience God, we can't really talk about God, okay? So he's not saying God doesn't exist. He's only saying that if God exists, you can't really experience him. Okay. What this does is this leads to this guy named Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher is going to say that religion is the feeling, is based on feeling. Okay, now we as good evangelical fundamentalists, we don't want feeling, we want reason and we want truth and that kind of thing, right? And so what Schleiermacher does, and Schleiermacher is the most important theologian of the modern period. Okay. And so, I mean, if you were to break down all of theology into the most important theologians, Schleiermacher is going to be on the list of the top 4 or 5. Okay. Incredibly important. However, we as, more conservative do not agree with most of what he says. Okay. And then what you see happening after Schleiermacher, and we're going to see this as we definitely towards the end of this semester, is that really all of theology becomes divided into those who accept Schleiermacher, saying that religion is about the feeling. It's not about logic. It's just about feeling. And this would be sort of liberalism. And I'm using that sort of in a technical term, not as, like Hillary Clinton is liberal, but it's a whole branch of theology. And then this is a branch of theology known as neo-orthodoxy. Karl Barth is the most famous of these theologians. And then there would be fundamentalism. And that also is a very loaded term. And I don't necessarily mean, somebody who doesn't think you can't have, you can't dance and stuff like that. But as a branch of being more literal with scripture and that sort of thing. Okay. So, wow, look at all of that writing I have all over that. It looks like a mess. But that is a big picture of church history, and we are basically here. So we've got a lot of work to do the last couple weeks. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed my scribbles all over the paper. Thanks.